The reality of what is happening in Gaza and Lebanon, because it's obviously not the only conflict in the world at the moment, and we shouldn't forget the others. But what is so crucial about this one is not just that it's the first genocide that has been live screened, that we're all seeing as it's happening. It's not just that our governments are enabling and facilitating it. They're profiting from it. And I'm going to try and explain why. But what this conflict means for the world is that the international rule of law doesn't exist. That arms export controls nationally, regionally, globally exist only on paper. That's the reality. So that when, a few weeks ago, Russia bombed a civilian dwelling in the Ukraine, and our government went apoplectic about it, the few of us in this world who are still sane, or actually, no, it's the other way around, the many of us in this world who are still sane, unlike our governments, were incredulous at their criticism of Russia. Not necessarily because we don't think they should have been criticizing Russia, but because what Israel is doing in Gaza and Lebanon is exponentially worse, which means they have zero credibility to speak about human rights, to speak about the rule of law, to speak about arms export controls. We now know that they can sell weapons to whoever they want, whenever they want, regardless of the circumstances. And that's terrifying. Now, as you know as well as I do, the roots of the conflict in the Middle East are profound and deep. Interestingly, to me as a South African, is that they include European settler colonialism, they include racist white supremacy, and they include imperialism, which I would argue is essential to capitalism. And it's because of those commonalities, as well as some others, that it was so symbolic and important that it was South Africa that took Israel to the International Court of Justice, where a panel of judges, chaired interestingly at the time by an American judge, ruled that Israel was likely committing genocide. Now, Keir Starmer, who's clearly far smarter than all of those judges, tells us he knows what genocide is because he was a human rights lawyer. First of all, he must have been an incredibly shit human rights lawyer, because it really isn't very complex. And if he doesn't even understand what a genocide is, then excuse my language, but how the fuck did he get a law degree? Because what he is a former human rights lawyer who has lost every shred of humanity. But that is what people will do in pursuit of power. And having had to endure Keir Starmer as our constituency MP for almost 10 years, I can tell you that the only interest that Keir Starmer has is power for Keir Starmer. That is the sole purpose of power for Keir Starmer. So, for me, it was particularly important that this extraordinary breadth of legal minds stood up before the ICJ, condemning Israel, a racist state as South Africa had been, but simply by their presence were making the statement, the oppressors have now become the lawyers, the judges. Sorry, the oppressed have now become the lawyers and the judges and the leaders. Because that too was a message to Israel, and a very important one. There are myriad geopolitical reasons for what is happening in the Middle East, for what is happening in the world. But what I want to talk about for a few moments is the economics of conflict and war and what we can do about them. Because I argue that they are absolutely central to the business of war in 2024. About 6 weeks ago, after yet another genocidal statement from Benjamin Netanyahu, in which he said that this war, as he calls it, is going to continue until at least the end of another 18 months. The next day, the Financial Times had an elated front-page article headlined, "War Bonanza for Defense Companies," and announced that because of Netanyahu's statement, British defense companies were going to see an earnings bonanza that the FT estimated at £55 billion. What depths have we sunk to? While tens of thousands of innocent people are being slaughtered to celebrate the profits that some people are going to make out of that slaughter. And what is important is who those people are. Because unless we understand who they are, we won't understand why our politicians offer us the quite pathetic menu of permanent austerity and forever wars. What our politicians, what our government does today, is it turns public money, our money, into private profits. Now, there are many ways it does this. The utility companies are the ones that strike us all immediately as we see our water and our electric bills shoot through the roof. Where, in my instance, in Camden, in Keir Starmer's constituency, my electricity bill, which has increased fourfold, is paid to a French utility company, EDF. My bills have gone up by 70-odd% every year for the last 2 years. That French company, which happens to be part owned by the French state, has its headquarters in its home country, where it is only allowed to increase prices by 4% a year. How is this possible? Living in Britain today feels as though, as we walk down the street, we're being hit over the head, very politely, with a cricket bat. And as we collapse unconscious to the ground, all these companies are literally pilfering our money from our pockets. And who is wielding the cricket bat? The government, our politicians. That is the reality of the situation we live in. But key to understanding this process is the reality that our political parties, our individual politicians, profit from our defense companies like BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce, Kinetic, and even, as you mentioned, Elbit Systems, one of Israel's most crucial defense companies, that had 10 factories in the United Kingdom. Today that is 7, for reasons that I'll come to. So how does this work? These defense companies are the most subsidized companies on the planet. They receive more public money, be they in the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, or other parts of Western Europe, than any other economic sector. In fact, in some countries, they receive more public money than all other economic sectors combined. The companies are treated, even though most of them are publicly listed, owned by huge financial institutions like BlackRock, Fidelity, and others, AXA. Some individual shareholders, but very few nowadays. But they are treated as though they are a part of government. You know, the senior executives at BAE Systems have the same national security clearance to attend meetings in government as the defense secretary. But they are beholden to their private shareholders, to whom, quarter on quarter, they have to deliver ever-increasing profits. But crucially, 40% of all corruption in the entire world takes place in the defense sector. Why? Because everything that happens in an arms deal happens behind a veil of national security-imposed secrecy. So we know nothing about it. When my book, The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade, was first published in late 2011, it was the first book published on the global arms trade since 1979. Because the people involved in the trade are very litigious, and because the information is so difficult to get hold of. So secrecy is key. But those bribes don't only go to Saudi Arabia or to Israel, where, by the way, one of the reasons that Benjamin Netanyahu started to destroy the judiciary in Israel, even before the onslaught against Gaza, was because he was facing innumerable corruption charges. 13 of those charges had to do with 3 arms deals between Germany and Israel, where millions of dollars of bribes were paid. The agent, the intermediary on those deals for the German arms companies, happened to be Netanyahu's legal advisor, the guy who actually sits in an office right next to the prime minister and gives him legal advice. He was the guy who facilitated the payment of the bribes and ensured that the money was appropriately laundered. For good measure, he's also Netanyahu's cousin. Because when you're talking about sums of money of this order, it's good to keep it in the family. So when Margaret Thatcher, may she rest in hell, when Margaret Thatcher sold 43 billion pounds of weapons to Saudi Arabia in what was called the Al-Yamama deal, the 6 billion with a B, it's not my accent, the 6 billion pounds of bribes that were paid didn't only go to the Saudi royal family. They went to a number of the intermediaries. Those intermediaries, what we call arms dealers, agents, or brokers, depending on their role, one of them ensured that Mark Thatcher, wastrel son of Margaret, got 12 million pounds. That led to some people describing the deal as the Who's Your Mama deal. Why did he get that money? He didn't do anything on the deal. He occasionally ensured his mother was available for a phone call. Because Maggie didn't want to have to continue to support her wastrel son, whose only achievement was getting lost in a desert. More importantly, Sir Richard Evans, the then chief executive of BAE Systems, big mate of Tony Blair's, received a luxury apartment in Mayfair in central London worth, in the mid-1980s, £6.5 million. Shudder to think what it's worth today. And the main intermediary, the main arms dealer on this transaction, wasn't some dodgy guy running around in khakis in African conflicts, trying to sell a few handguns and sniper rifles. It was a multi-millionaire called Wafik Said, after whom the business school at Oxford University is named. I was once giving a talk at the Said Center, and I didn't know who the Said was. And I started off saying, isn't it ironic I'm talking about arms dealers in something called the Said Center, because one of the arms dealers I'm investigating at the moment is a guy called Wafik Said. I was literally dragged off the stage, and the organizer said to me, you know that it's Wafik Said who actually gave the money for the business school. So I went out, and all I spoke about for the rest of my talk was Wafik Said. Wafik Said then handed out huge sums of money to hundreds and hundreds of people in Britain, not for their own well-being or welfare, but to pay in donations to the Conservative Party. So they're not listed as donations from an arms company or from an arms dealer or from an arms deal. They're just a whole lot of individual contributions. Michael Portillo, Margaret Thatcher's defense secretary, went straight from the cabinet table to the boardroom table at BAE Systems. We used to call it a revolving door, the way ministers and military leaders would move between government and the arms companies. In a recent report, Campaign Against the Arms Trade quite correctly suggested, let's forget about the revolving door. Let's just call it an open plan office, because that's what it is. But in addition to that, individual politicians sometimes make extortionate amounts of money out of this trade. Let's think for a moment of what Margaret Thatcher described as her greatest achievement, Tony Blair, because he turned the Labour Party into a neoliberal warmongering party. I estimate incredibly conservatively, and I haven't updated this for years now, that on leaving office, or since leaving office, Tony Blair has made at least £110 million personally out of companies who benefited from the decision to invade Iraq and his association with BAE Systems and Richard Evans, who, by the way, he knighted. So, if we're going to keep this money that oils the wheels of our political systems and ensures that in Britain, like much of the so-called Western world, we live in the best democracies money can buy, we need conflict so that we can continually increase our defense budgets so that there is more and more money flowing into our political process. Yes, it sounds reductionist. It sounds overly simple. But often the worst crimes are incredibly simple. They don't have to be complicated. They just have to be hidden. So, to ensure that our defense budgets continually increase, we manipulate geopolitics. We manipulate what I call the politics of fear. You should try going to an arms fair. I used to be allowed to. Since I published about this stuff, I'm no longer allowed. They're terrifying. My first training was as a clinical psychologist. I should have just set up practice at arms fairs. And as people emerged completely depressed and fearful, I could have given them therapy. Because what they do is, they tell us everything that is about to happen in the world, and it's all cataclysmic. It's been cataclysmic for decades, but it is always going to be even worse next year. And that's why we have produced these extraordinary new weapons that are going to keep us safe. And they become more and more technologically advanced, so we take less and less responsibility for actually killing other human beings, but it also means they become more and more expensive. And you know what? They're not very good. So the F-35, which Jenny mentioned, the most expensive weapons system produced in history. 2 years ago, a defense inspector general, like the auditor general, in the United States of America, issued a report that said, despite the American taxpayer spending over $2 trillion on the building of the F-35 jet, and we have loads of them in Britain, 30-something of them, and Lockheed Martin recently said Britain is likely to buy another 78. Over $2 trillion. The Inspector General concludes, the combat suite, the brains, the technology of the thing, not fit for purpose. Doesn't work. When it was due to be unveiled at the Farnborough Air Show, never made it. Caught fire as it was leaving its airbase in America. In the film of the Shadow World, which you can find for free on YouTube at the moment, just look for the 94-minute version. Just search YouTube for Shadow World film, and don't tell the producers I told you this. There's a brilliant former aerospace design engineer at the Pentagon, Pierce Spray. He says the best thing about the F-35 is that the only people it's going to harm are its test pilots. It failed its first 14 test flights. Sadly, Pierre was wrong. The F-35 is being used, just like the old bombers were, to drop bombs and missiles on Gaza and Lebanon as we speak. So we've paid trillions and trillions for a jet fighter that is being used like the old B-52 bombers. Because we have to increase the cost to increase the flow of money into our political system. We're working on a book at the moment called Making a Killing, How the West Profits from Slaughter in Gaza and Yemen. We're trying to work out the figures of how much profit has been made out of these catastrophes. It's mind-blowing. We aren't anywhere near an answer, but the figures we have are just simply mind-blowing. I was writing a chapter on the train coming up last night. It is the most depressing thing I've ever had to do in my life. And I lived through apartheid in South Africa, albeit as a privileged white person. So, having depressed you all, I'll hand out my cards as a therapist, although I've never practiced before. But I honestly feel at the moment that far better than the various degrees I have in politics and economics and finance, I studied a lot because it was the only way to stay out of the apartheid military. The most important degrees I did were my first 3 degrees, which were in clinical psychology. And the book that I really want to be writing is just a very simple book called The Madness of the Moment, in which war is peace, we escalate to de-escalate, and if we criticize Israel, the racists are able to call the anti-racists racist. And our media goes along with it. Because our media is owned, run by, and for those very same financial institutions that profit from the defense companies as their major shareholders. It's a brilliant business model if you're a part of it. If you're the rest of us, it's criminality dressed up as a free market. We've never had a free market in this country or any of the West. We have systems of corporate welfareism. So In order to try and appease your depression without making money from you, I ask the question, what can we do? And the subtitle of The Monstrous Anger of the Guns, in which Paul and I are amongst the co-editors, along with a colleague of mine, Rona Mickey and Jeremy Corbyn, how the global arms trade is ruining the world and what we can do about it. And what the book does is it has a series of chapters from groups or individuals working on various ways to take on the arms trade. And it ranges from those incredibly smart lawyers, unlike Keir Starmer, who are involved in strategic litigation against our governments, against the defense companies, against some of the individuals and institutions involved. It has Lindsay German, one of the co-founders of Stop the War, talking about how the protest movement that extraordinarily has been bringing out hundreds of thousands of people every alternate weekend for well over a year now, how protest has forced this mediocre government of ours into, at least in a superficial sense, pretending to do something about arms sales to Israel. The fact that they've stopped 10% of the licenses, as Jenny said, and it'll probably be 10% that was never used in Gaza anyway, is a reflection that we've had some impact, at least. As was mentioned, a brilliant chapter from Anthony Lowenstein on how the occupied territories are effectively used as a testing laboratory, not just for Israeli weapons, but for Western weapons generally. And then an extraordinary chapter by Palestine Action, these brave, committed activists who break into Elbit System factories and try and destroy the weaponry that is being produced there for the Israeli Defense Force. What we are seeing now is that those activists, along with pro-Palestinian journalists, are being charged under anti-terror legislation by our new government. So if you oppose genocide that you can watch on your screen all day, you're a terrorist now. May I suggest that the real terrorists are those perpetrating the genocide and all of those enabling, facilitating, and profiting from that genocide. Finally, let me say, and I'm sorry to end on a hopeful note, as I mentioned outside earlier, I got involved in the struggle against apartheid in my teens because my mother, a Holocaust survivor who lost dozens of her family, mainly at Auschwitz, where I've lectured on genocide prevention, when she arrived in South Africa and saw the way black Africans were being treated like the Jews of Europe had been treated, she believed that as someone who had survived the Holocaust hidden in a coal cellar for 3.5 years, never again wasn't just about Jews, but was obviously about all humanity. And so I was incredibly privileged to play a tiny role in our struggle for freedom from apartheid in South Africa. And when I had to leave my own country at very short notice in the 1980s to avoid serving in the apartheid military, I thought I would never again set foot in South Africa in my lifetime. But 4 years later, the ANC was unbanned, our political prisoners were freed, our exiles could return home. And we started a negotiation process that a further 4 years later led to our first ever democratic elections. When I left in 1986, if someone had said to me, in 4 years' time you will see the end of apartheid or the beginning of the end of apartheid, I would have used my training as a clinical psychologist and offered them a straitjacket, because there was no prospect of it whatsoever. It felt as bleak as the Middle East does today. 8 years later, Nelson Mandela was our president. So change happens. It happens by the commitment, the courage, the resilience of those suffering the worst consequences of the oppression, and the support of tens of millions of people around the world. And that's why we have to engage in BDS like we never have before against the state of Israel. That's why, where we can, we've got to support direct action, which I believe is the most effective way to take on this disgusting war profiteering that our world experiences as we do. And we have to do this because the world is experiencing an existential moment. And from here, we will spiral into unimagined darkness, or it will be the moment at which the majority of people in the world realize how we are being hoodwinked by those who are supposed to be representing us, our political leaders. And we have to do this because, as Nelson Mandela said when he walked free from 27 years in an apartheid prison, not, "I'm free, let's party." Instead, he said, "Our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people." Thanks.